Hello, bonjour, my name is Jessica and welcome to my channel. If today is your first time, don't worry about it, it's my first time too. What I'd like to do with this channel is I'd like to bring you along on a journey with me as I learn how to knit and crochet, usually in the company of a lovely cup of tea, like this one in front of me. Now, a little bit of background. I am basically a self-taught knitter and crocheter. I taught myself how to do these out of books, which is great. Books are a wonderful resource and I'm very glad I had access to them, but I didn't have anybody that was teaching me in person in my life who could explain things a little bit differently to me. It was the way it was in the book and that was it. So what I thought I would do is I would maybe share some of my knowledge that I have gained over my years doing these crafts and present it to you in maybe a different way, some ways that you haven't really thought about these things before. What we're going to do today is we're going to analyze the basics of how you get from a straight piece of yarn like this one that I have in front of me, just a nice straight piece of yarn, and work your way into a lovely, gorgeous fabric like this. So this is an example of a type of granny square. It's a type of crochet. And you can see the different types of stitches, how they all work together. They all started off as just a single piece of yarn. Some other examples of how you can join pieces of yarn together with loops and twists is knitting, like this. The color's not great. You can't really see a lot of stitch definition here, but you can see that there's a bit of a transition. Some stitches look like waves. Some stitches look a little bit like lace. It's very stretchy. There's lots of different examples. Here's another piece of crochet work with a little bit of ribbing and then a flat type stitch. This is actually referred to as a moss stitch. And you can use all of these stitches to make wonderful things like cup cozies, for example, for all that tea and coffee that you drink out in the wild. Or little animals, cute little kitty cats. This is actually a coaster. How can you tell I have a theme going on? But again, you can see how the stitches, all work together. And by knowing how they work together and where to put them all, you can create these wonderful little objects. But how does it work? So let's go back to just the single piece of yarn. The really elemental basics of it. Knitting and crocheting is all about joining together a piece of yarn with loops. When we knit, we make a series of loops. I'll just make a few here so that you can see. Maybe we'll do 3. So 1, 2, 3. We bring another piece of yarn across and we can make new loops, and those loops lock into the first set and we start to build a piece of fabric. Now, as you can see, as I'm trying to do this with my fingers, first of all, the yarn is very thick. And even then, it's very complicated. So we have these loops, and they're joined together. And we create more loops, and we create more loops, and that's how we build a fabric. But doing it with your fingers is kind of a little bit awkward. So, people have come up with tools over the centuries. Different types of tools, different ways of joining the loops have been thought of. Now we use knitting needles. Now this is a very large knitting needle. And I'm using a very large knitting needle, hopefully so that you can see what it is that we're doing. You wouldn't actually use this size of needle to knit one of these little projects, like these little cats that I showed you here. They wouldn't be made on something this big. This needle is even actually too big for this yarn. But hopefully, using this big needle, you will be able to see how it works and how the fabric builds. So here we are back with our single straight piece of yarn. Knitting and crochet are all about making fabric by making loops out of a single piece of yarn and linking those loops together. The difference between knitting and crochet is how those loops are manipulated. With knitting, we start by making a series of multiple loops on one end of a string or yarn, we'll then bring the rest of the yarn, the working end of the yarn, around and form more loops that attach to our first row. And we do this over and over and over again to create a piece of fabric. Before we get into how we join those loops together, it's important to understand a little bit of the anatomy or the language that we use when we talk about these loops or stitches. As I mentioned, the piece of yarn that's attached to the rest of the ball, the long piece, is called our working yarn. And you can see in this example, the working yarn that I have here is pointed off to the right, off to my right. I'm a right-handed knitter. So when I set up my knitting, I start with a series of loops like these ones on the needle that I hold in my left hand. And so the very first loop that I'm working into ends up being the far right loop. Now, if you're left-handed, we would simply switch this over. So if you were knitting left-handed, you would have the same number of loops, but you would likely hold them on the needle in your right hand with your working yarn heading off to the left, so that you're working the leftmost loop first. Now it's important to remember you can knit any way you want. You can be left-handed and you can use a right-handed knit method, because let's face it, a lot of early books and even a lot of YouTube videos and podcasts and Instagram and TikTok now are right-handed based. People do right-handed knitting. It's possible to be a left-handed person but knit right-handed. It's also possible to be a right-handed person and knit left-handed, maybe because it's more comfortable. Maybe you've had an injury or that sort of thing, and it makes it easier for you to use your left hand to do most of the manipulating of the needle. That's fine. You just need to understand that the leading leg of yarn, the working yarn is going to be the yarn that is attached to the ball, and it will be facing whichever hand it is that you are working with. Each loop that we're talking about has two legs. The leading leg of each loop is the leg that is closest to the working end of your needle. So just as an example, this is set up for a left-handed knitter. The needle that these loops are attached to would be held pointing to the left. So this would be the first loop that we work, the leftmost loop, and the leftmost strand of that loop is what we call the leading leg. Again, if I switch this over and I bring my working yarn to the right, I have my needle holding these loops pointing to the right, and I have 3 loops, and I'm working into the rightmost loop. You can see that the needle holding the yarn is pointing towards my working yarn, working yarn being the yarn that is attached here to my ball, to the rest of my yarn. My first loop that I'm going to work is this loop on the right, and the leg on the right of that loop is going to be my leading leg. Why is it important that you know this? It's important to understand your leading leg and where it is, because that will determine whether or not you make straight, smooth stitches or twisted stitches. If you want straight, smooth, untwisted stitches, you want to make sure that you're always working into the leading leg of your yarn. If you want to twist your stitch, you can do that by working into the back leg or the trailing leg of your yarn. Now, how does that work? Right now, I'm showing you these loops as they're lying flat. But let's imagine that they're actually on the needle. So when we cast on stitches, when we put these loops onto our needle, we start this end, and you see how these loops wrap themselves around the needle. They're not sitting flat anymore. They're one end is behind the needle and one end is in front of the needle. Now, these loops are in the same orientation that they were when I had them lying just flat. And I'll make them a little bit bigger so you can still see the loops. Again, if the needle that they're sitting on is pointing to the right and my working yarn is pointing off to the right, then the first stitch, the first loop that I'm going to be working into is the one that is on the right side, and the leading leg of that loop or stitch is going to be this one, which is the right leg or the leading leg, and it is in front of this needle. the trailing leg is behind. It's sitting behind the needle. So my left leg of this stitch is sitting back or behind my needle. When I bring my second needle to work into this stitch, which is what we have to do when we knit, I have two choices. I can take my second needle and I can work in the leading leg. I can stick it either right to left or left to right. And in a future video, we'll talk about the different stitches that you can get depending on whether you go right to left or left to right. But if I'm working into that front leading leg, it's going to mean that my stitches lie flat. On the other hand, and I will try and do this so you can see, I'm actually working into the back or trailing leg, the one that is behind the holding needle. Then I'm potentially going to end up with a twisted stitch. It's not that twisted stitches are bad. Some patterns use twisted stitches to give emphasis to different elements or to create interest in how the work finishes. But you need to understand how you get a twisted stitch. And if you understand how you can make a twisted stitch, you also understand how you can fix a twisted stitch when it happens by mistake. Sometimes as you're knitting along, you accidentally end up twisting your stitch. So you see what I did there? I twisted the stitch, twisted it around. It's now sitting on the hook the opposite way, and we've got this extra little crossover on the bottom. In this case, the leading leg of our stitch, the one that's attached to our working yarn here, is actually the one sitting behind our needle, unlike these other two stitches that I didn't touch. So now on our needle, we have a twisted stitch with that leading leg actually sitting in a different spot than the leading leg of the other stitches. In order to fix that twisted stitch when you're knitting along, you could take it physically off the needle, try turning it around and putting it back on, and that would untwist it. Or if your pattern says to knit into the front, but you know you have a twisted stitch, you can actually fix it just by going and working into the back of the stitch. And we'll talk about that more in detail a little bit later. But that's why it's important to understand how these stitches line up, how they're supposed to sit on the needle, and what they look like and where you're supposed to be working into them. Now again, these stitches are very loose just so that you can see the different parts. When you were actually knitting, it'd be a lot tighter to the needle. There's one more thing that we need to talk about before we get into how to actually make knit stitches. As you can see here, the way that I have the yarn, it's just very loosely draped across the needle. There is nothing securing or attaching these loops to each other the way they are right now. In our very first row of knitting, we need to do a foundation or a starting row that locks those stitches together to give us a finished end of the fabric. If we don't, what ends up happening when we take our needle out, we have a lovely piece of fabric from here up, and then we have these gaps and little valleys all along the edge. It doesn't make for a nice finished edge. So we need to create that foundation. And we do that by casting on stitches onto the needle in a way that they interlock or join up together. And that's just what we do in the very, very first row. So let's have a look at that right now and see one way of casting on a row of stitches that will get us ready to do knitting. A lot of cast-ons start with what is known as a slip knot or a slip stitch. There's lots of different ways to make a slip knot to start your cast-on. This is how I do it, but you'll see other people do it other ways, and there is no wrong way. What you are doing is you're making a loop. So see here, I make a loop with the material. I take the working yarn. I make sure the working yarn is underneath my little end. I bring that over top, put a loop through. I pull the ends to make a knot. Now I have my loop. So if you want to see that as I do it around my fingers, I make a loop around my fingers. I take the working end of the yarn, lift up this loop, push the working end through, pull on the loop, pull on the starting end, tighten that knot, and I'm left with a loop. You can then take this slip knot, put it onto your needle. Again, I am right-handed. I do my knitting right-handed. So I'm going to put this on what will be my left needle, tighten it up, and now I'm ready to add the rest of the loops to make my foundation chain, to make my foundation row. There are lots of different ways to cast on stitches. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm just going to twist my stitches to cast them on so that they are now locked together. So again, these are just a series of twisted stitches like I previously explained. I'm sliding the stitches on with the working end at the left of the loop, not the right of the loop. This is not a very stretchy or elastic cast on. This is not the type of cast on that you will use for most of the work that you do, most of the knitting that you do, but it is good enough for right now to give us a cast on set of 8 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, so that we can now go into how to actually knit. Because what would a beginner knitter video be if it didn't include some actual knitting? I have my 8 starting stitches on my left-handed needle with the tip facing the right. I have my working yarn going to my right. I pick up my second needle in my right hand, and I'm ready to start knitting. Now, there are several different ways of holding your knitting needles. You may notice a theme to this. There are different ways of doing almost every step of knitting. There are English knitters, there are continental knitters, there are European knitters, there are combination knitters, there are Eastern style knitters. Everybody using a slightly different style has a slightly different way of holding the needles, of where they place their yarn, of how the stitches go on and off their needles. I am a right-handed knitter. I hold my needles like I'm holding a knife. And what I mean by that, the knife hold means that I hold my knitting needles with my hand on top and my finger and my thumb controlling things. The same way I would hold a knife to cut my food. The other way of holding your needle is to do what is called a pencil hold. And now I'm not good at doing a pencil hold, so let me try and demonstrate a pencil hold for you. A pencil hold is where you hold, instead of with your hand on top, you hold with your hand underneath, like you would hold a pencil. Whichever way is most comfortable for you is the way that you should do. One way is not more right or more wrong than any other. When I go to knit as a right-handed knitter, I pick up my needle with my loops. You want to slide the loops towards the tip of your needle, not so far that they fall off your needle, but close, because you are going to be working them off your needle. You take your second needle and you work into this front loop. Now, because I did a foundation row of twisted stitches, this row will look a little bit different than every other row. I still work, though, into the front of this loop, and to do a knit stitch, I work the front of the loop, I take the needle, I go from the left side under the front, and I cross it to make a T. Some people have a large angle, some people have straight up and down. The important thing is that you come into the loop from the left side, the front leg, pushing that loop. I will pull it large so you can see it. My needle goes front to back, left to right, and that loop is now joining my two needles, and my needles are, the points are crossed. Somehow, you now need to twist the working yarn around your working needle, which is the one that I'm holding in my right hand, this point right here. You take the working yarn and you want to wrap it around the needle. So again, I'm taking my working yarn, which is pointing off to my right. I'm bringing it down, around, up the left side of that lower working needle, and wrapping it across the top. So again, it ends up pointing towards my right. This gives us a loop of yarn on this needle. We want to take that loop of yarn, make it tight against that back needle, pull the back needle out until you can catch that new loop on the tip of your needle back through the loop you went into first, and you've created a new loop here on your working needle. I now have my old loop on my held left-handed needle, and I have a new loop on my right-handed needle. So the only thing left to do to finish the stitch is I need to slide that old loop off and keep the new loop on. And now we do the same thing in the next stitch. I go to the left side of that stitch, into that front leg, put the tip of my needle through, and I cross the tips of my needles with that loop, and I will twist it so you can hopefully see it. That loop is going around both of my needles and they are twisted. I take my working yarn, I wrap it underneath and around the left side of my working needle. I hold it tight against my working needle. I pull my working needle back towards me. Now, what I find easiest is I keep that tip of that working needle touching the holding needle, and I just bring it up and come back out the loop that I first made. So now I have a second new loop on my right-handed needle, and I just need to slide the other loop off. I have 2 on my working needle and my other 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 loops remaining on my left-handed needle. So we do it again. Come in from the left side of this loop. Catch the loop, cross underneath with your working needle. We now have the loop that is coming around. The loop that is coming around both of our needles. I pick up my working yarn, I wrap it underneath and up to the left of my lower working needle. Wrap it around tight, pull that needle out, let the tip rub against the other needle until I can pop that new loop up through the old one, push it onto my needle so that it's securely on there. I'm not going to lose it. And I pull the old loop off my left needle. As you can see, I have a lot of slack in between these stitches. I can move the needles quite far. This is in part because of how I cast them on, but it's also because I'm using a very loose stitch, a very loose tension, just for learning, for demonstrating. As we get further into learning how to knit, we'll talk about tension. We'll talk about how much tension and where that tension is supposed to be and what people mean by tension and gauge. But for right now, don't be too concerned about it. You're learning how to move loops from one needle to the other. Start with baby steps. Go to the left side of the loop on your left needle. Push the tip of your right working needle into the left loop, left to right, front to back, come out. Your needles are crossed with the loop going around both of those needles. Pick up your working yarn, take that working yarn down, around, up the left side of your needle, across the top, hold it kind of tight, pull the tip of your working needle out, ride it along the edge of your left-handed needle, pop it up, pull that new stitch. You can hold it with your finger if you're worried about it, make it secure, and then slide the old stitch off the end of the left-handed needle. Now, what if you knit left-handed? Well, if you're knitting left-handed, your working needle will be in your left hand. The rest of your stitches will be held on the needle in your right hand, and your working yarn will likely be off to the left. But it's the same concept. Everything is just a little backwards from what I just said. So now, instead of going from the left to the right, we want to work the loops off the needle in our right hand from the right to the left. So you want to put the tip underneath you want to pull that working yarn. This time you're bringing it under around to the right as you come up, making that loop, pulling the left working needle out, rubbing it along, creating your new stitch, and pulling the old stitch off your needles. Now things got a little bit twisted there as I was moving things around. Let me just readjust that. So again, go in, bring our working yarn around, oops, pull the stitch off. Continue doing that until you get to the end of the row. So I'm going to switch back because, like I said, I do things right-handed. As you can see, with all the twisting and moving things from one hand to another, things got a little bit twisted about down at the bottom. But you should have starting to see a repetitive pattern with the way your loops line up. So here, let me finish these last couple of stitches. And I'll show you what we do when we get to the end of the row. So you slide off your stitch, work your last stitch, which is your slip knot, which, depending on which way you make your slip knot, may be a little bit tight. Loosen that up enough to get your needle in there. Pull your working yarn around, make a new loop, pull it off, and now all of your loops, again, your tension is a little bit off, but that's okay. All of your loops are now on your left-handed, or correction, your right-handed needle. And all we need to do at this point is take this needle, turn it around, hold it in our left hand, and we're ready to start again and knit our next row. So here we are after having turned our work over, turned our needle over, and you can see down here at the bottom we have our foundation, the first row with its little starting tail here, and above that we have our first row of knitting, our first row of knit stitches. And because we've turned them over, you can see that we have these little bumps facing us on every stitch. And this last one here is just a little bit looser than the others, but you can see these little bumps, and those are the knit stitches that we just finished on our first row. Now what I want to do is I want to slide this off the needle and show you how it's going to line up here. So now if we lay this or push this down flat, you can see the fabric as it's starting to grow. So again, we have on our loops, I'm just going to hold that end down here. We have our working yarn now facing towards the right. This loop is going to be the first loop that we work into. And this is the leading leg of that first loop. And you see how when we take the needle out, this all lies flat. None of our stitches are twisted. They're all nice and flat. Our work is curving a little bit, but that's okay. And then to make sure everything goes back the way it's supposed to when things go back on the needle, we make sure that the leading leg of every stitch is at the front of the needle. And here we are, ready again to work our next stitch. What we're going to do now is we're going to talk a little bit about the knit stitch specifically and what kind of fabric we get. When we knit our first row, first full row of knit stitches, we took our second needle, in my case, my right-handed needle, and we put it in the left side of the loop, front to back. We did a knit stitch. Every time you do a knit stitch, you are going from the front of your work with the tip of your needle. You're going from the front of your work towards the back. That is a knit stitch. Specifically, this stitch going from the front to the back through the front loop of the needle is knitting through the front loop of the needle. Like we did before, bring the working yarn around, pull through, slide the stitch off. Now I want to show you what this looks like. If I take my working needle out and I straighten these out, you'll see that I have my foundation row of stitches down here. I have my first row of stitches here with the top of this loop going to the back, and I have this new stitch that I just made sitting here, and it is not twisted. Neither is the stitch below it twisted. Again, just put that back on my needle the exact same way I took it off. Front to back, left to right, working yarn around, new stitch, pull through, pull it off. Now we have 2 stitches. If we continue in this pattern, knitting every stitch, we are going to end up with a fabric that's going to have these little bumps always facing us on the left needle. It's a little bit hard to see here, but you can see from the row below, the bumps are facing us, but on the right needle, there's no bump there. If I was to take my right needle and turn it over, there are those bumps. So the bumps on your knit stitch always end up on the back of your working needle and the front of your opposite needle. This creates a fabric that has a specific name. So let me just finish this row here. Almost done. Pull through. Last stitch. Straighten that fabric out a little bit. Okay, so we're starting to see a bit of a pattern. We have bumps on this side from the row below, no bumps on the right needle. When we turn that right needle over, so it's now my left held needle, I have the row below has no bumps, and this row that I just worked, I'm seeing those bumps again. If we continue in this pattern, knitting every single row, we end up with what is called garter stitch. And garter stitch looks like this. It has these wavy ridges, these are the bumps, and when you flip the fabric over, see, there's my tail, I flipped it over, it looks exactly the same on the other side. Garter stitch is a reversible stitch, and you achieve it by knitting every single row through the front loop. Now, remember we talked about our leading leg. The front loop is our leading leg. And if we turn our needle over, the back of the loop is here on the back of the needle, and it's our trailing leg. A knit stitch goes front to back. When we knit through the front loop, it goes front to back, left to right. It is possible to also knit and make a knit stitch through the back loop or the trailing loop. If I want to do that, I'm going to take this working needle, let me move these over, and I'm going to turn my needle a little bit so that you can see better. This is the back of my stitch, the back of my work. Front is where my thumb is, back is over here. Knit goes front to back. When I am knitting through the back loop, I still want my needle to go front to back. In order to do that, I need to go right to left. But I'm still going front to back. This is what we call knitting through the back loop. Again, you take your working yarn, wrap it around the same way you did before, pull the tip, keeping it touching, pull that new loop, pull the old loop off, and we have a new stitch. I want you to see what this does though. If I pull this off my needle and I flatten out my work, you'll notice I have created that twisted stitch. This is where the twist shows up when you knit through the back loop. Again, sometimes that can be a style element and done purposefully, but sometimes it's done by mistake. All right. What I'm going to do now, for demonstration purposes, I'm going to show you if I force the work to lie flat, we're getting multiple twists happening. I'm just going to pull this loop out. Here we go. And I'm going to put this previous loop back onto my left holding needle in the same orientation as all of the other ones, with its leading leg on the front of the needle. Okay, I've gotten rid of that twisted stitch. All right. The next stitch that is very common in knitting is called a purl stitch. A purl stitch is the exact opposite of a knit stitch. So, for knit stitches, we go front to back. For purl stitches, we want to go from the back to the front, still through that first leading leg of that first loop. We're still working in the front of the stitch, but we're taking our needle from the back of the work and bringing it to the front of the work through that stitch. It's important when we're doing purls, this working yarn, you need to get it to the front of your work before you start wrapping it around your needle. So the yarn is at the front of the work. The new needle, the working needle, goes back to front, right to left, so everything is opposite. We now have this stitch on our needle. We have the working yarn coming to the front. We're again going to wrap it around, this time top to bottom. Pull that working needle out, drag the tip, pop the new stitch onto the working needle. Grab your working yarn if you need to make it tight. Pull the old stitch off the holding needle. We now have a purl stitch. And if we look at the purl stitch, again, I'm going to pull it off the needle. I'm going to flatten out my work. And you're going to notice that for the purl stitch, we now have the loop of the stitch we just came through sitting on top of our new stitch instead of behind the new stitch like it does with knitting. When we were knitting our stitches, we ended up with these bumps all on the back. Now these bumps will all show up on the front. Because the purl stitch is the exact opposite of a knit stitch, if you make an entire row of purl stitches, turn your work, and then make another row all of purl stitches, you'll still end up with a piece of fabric created in the garter stitch, where the bumps go back and forth, one on either side. Again, purl. We take the needle, we go back to front through that front leg. We take our working yarn, wrap it around. Back to front, the working yarn wraps around. So if we look at the fabric that we're starting to create, we now have our bumps from the row before facing us on our working needle, and the bumps that we've just created facing us. Because we've purled these stitches, these are often called purl bumps. But there's an interesting thing that happens when you knit one row, but you purl the next row. So let me finish these few stitches. So there, I've finished this time a purl row. So now I have 2 rows where all the bumps are facing me on my right needle. When I turn this needle over and make it my holding needle, you'll see on the fabric I have no bumps. Everything makes these lovely little upside down V's. It lies very flat, and this material is called a stockinette stitch. So when you alternate knit and purl rows, you get a stockinette stitch, which is very smooth and flat on one side, which we usually have as the outside or the right side of our fabric. The side that we want to look at, if we're making a sweater or a jacket, this would be the outside, the right side of the fabric. And on the opposite side, which we also call the wrong side, you get all of your bumps all on the same side. So this side of the fabric will have lots and lots and lots of ridges on it, and the other side of the fabric is nice and flat and smooth. So that is how to knit and how to purl. The only thing left for making something small, like maybe a dishcloth, is how do I get it off my needle? Just like with casting on, just like with making slip knots, there are lots of different ways to cast off or finish off a piece of work. How to get it off your needles without everything unraveling all over the place. I'm just going to show you one way, which is a simple 2-stitch bind off. I'm going to start the first stitch like any other knit stitch. I'm going to go front to back, left to right. I'm going to pick up the working yarn from behind, around. Going to pull that new loop through. I'm going to pull it off. I'm going to do the same with the second stitch. In from the front, wrap the yarn around, behind, pull it through, slide the stitch off. But now, instead of just doing my third stitch, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up this first stitch that I made with my fingers, maybe with a little crochet hook or a needle if you're using smaller sizes than I am. I'm going to lift it really high. See, I'm going to pull it away from the needle. I'm going to slide it towards the tip, and I'm going to pull that first stitch over top of my second stitch and pull the first stitch only off the end of my needle. Now I only have one stitch left on my needle and one stitch that's now bound off at the top of my work. Tighten that up a little bit. I'm going to do the same thing. I have one stitch on my right needle. I'm going to knit the next stitch, pull through, pick up that new loop, slide the old loop off, pick up the first stitch on my right needle, bring it over top of that second stitch, bring it off, leaving just the second stitch as the only stitch on my needle. I'm going to continue doing that around, pull through, off, pick up, over, and off, front to back, around, pull the tip through, pick up that first stitch on my right needle, over, off, knit, lift, off, knit, lift, off, and this is the last stitch on my left needle. I'm going to again knit that stitch, new stitch, last one, lift the first one, pull it over, pull that first stitch off my needle, and now I have one stitch left. If I just take my needle out, you can see that there's a loop there. And if I pull this end, I'm going to pull that loop and it's going to start unraveling all of my work. So instead, I'm going to make that loop bigger. And I'm going to cut the end of my working yarn, and I'm going to pull that loop until the end of my yarn comes through. I'm going to tug it tight. Now when I pull on that working yarn, it's a knot. It's not going to unravel. And there is my piece of fabric, my very small piece of fabric with my stockinette stitch and my knit bind off at the top. Again, kind of stretchy, but that's mostly because of the yarn and the huge needles that we were using. But there is my little tiny piece of fabric. And that is how you knit and also how you purl. Thanks so much. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you for watching. Come back again. We'll talk about crochet. We'll talk about tension. We'll talk about other stitches, other fabrics, and other exciting things as I learn how to knit and crochet. Bye-bye.